And now, live from England, bringing you news and analysis that you won't find on the corporate and government mainstream media. It's the WideShut Webcast.
Welcome one, welcome all. This is the WideShut Webcast on Resistance Radio. As always, I'm your host, Keelan Balderson, and you can find all of my articles and videos and stuff at wideshut.co.uk, and for the network, it's resistradio.com. If you haven't already, please resubscribe to Mr. Brit's YouTube channel. I'll paste that in. That got taken offline a few days ago for whatever reason, and he's signed up with a Resist Radio account instead. My channel, as always, is youtube.com/WideShutUK. Interesting week, as is most weeks these days. One thing that we can't really claim is that we're living in boring times. As much as I hate the current system, I am in some ways thankful that I'm around at a time where there seems to be change in the air. I'm thankful that I'm around at a time where the evolution of ideas is taking another leap forward. The internet being a major part in that, I think. Although they're obviously trying to censor the internet. I think he talked about that on his show last week. But yeah, I think it's highly possible, and I was talking about this with somebody on Saturday night who I had no idea was kind of into this stuff. He just kind of brought up the Federal Reserve, and I was like, oh, yeah, I know that shit as well. Let's have a drunken ramble about the world. And, you know, I said I think it's highly possible within my lifetime we're going to create a system and a state of living that's radically different from the one we're living in now. Whether that's slap bang in the middle of a corrupt, centralized system that we could describe as a new world order with global governance, or some kind of decentralized system with individual freedom, I'm thinking we're going to end up in a grey area in between. But in my lifetime, I do think, you know, if I'm a betting man, shit's going to happen. Something's going to happen. And if it doesn't, I'll be thoroughly annoyed. But anyway, that's really why we're here at Resistance Radio, talking about it, analysing the various paths that humanity could go down, possibly. And with that, we're going to go to this week's New World Order Quote of the Week, the part of the show where we take a look at a quote or a news article that discusses this shift in global power. And this week we're back on the topic of climate change, which by my reasoning is being used as a method to control people and take away the last remnants of the middle class, really, whereby we end up with a super elite class kind of beyond our reach, and everybody else is rationed, smart metered, green police, you know, the whole gambit that seems to be at least being tried to be pushed through. I'm not sure how successful it's really being right now. I mean, a lot of the pull up this article in particular, just mention, you know, New World Order and things like that. And this article is from the Ugandan Monitor, which, you know, Uganda, although it's by a British Lord Debon of the Conservatives, but nonetheless it's in a Ugandan paper. And the title of the article, Durban Illuminates the Emerging New World Order. And this Lord guy who's written this article, he is actually a Catholic, and we all know how the Pope several times has called for a new world order. But anyway, The outcome of the latest round of climate change negotiations in Durban was a good one, was good as any dared hope for. A second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, together with agreement from all countries to begin negotiations on a new legally binding instrument or an agreement with legal force, is a major step forward. However, Durban will be remembered for much more than that, as the place where the tectonic plates of international relations fundamentally shifted. So he calls legally binding instruments and legal force for all this climate stuff, he calls that a step forward. Personally, I call that a step backwards. You know, they want to start using legal force. Once laws are in place, it's extremely difficult to go back on them. Especially if you were duped and find out what you were once pushing for is now wrong. And, you know, I just don't see how global force is the right way to kind of look after the planet. I don't know what anyone else thinks of that, but can't we all be loving and do it voluntarily if the science proves it to be that way? But never mind. The group of countries that drove the outcome in South Africa was a new coalition involving the EU and the basic bloc countries of Brazil, China, India, Mexico, and South Africa. The emergence of this alliance of countries is significant for two reasons. First, these countries share a vision about the future and are committed to a path of low-carbon, sustainable development. They recognize that this is the only pro-growth, pro-development strategy. Or it could be that they see politics, you know, on the world stage and don't want to be left out. They see all these countries, these powerful countries, blabbing on about climate change. So if you're this itty-bitty developing country somewhere that's never really had any power, you're going to jump to be part of the club. You're going to want to be involved with all the other countries that are going along with it, so you can look like this cool guy on the world stage like everybody else, without realizing that low-carbon development actually puts developing countries at a huge disadvantage because they have to go green from day one. Think about that. Think about the third world in particular, where this is even more important. Countries that haven't developed yet, they have to start from day one going green and having carbon, you know, taxes and all this rubbish. How do you think they're ever going to catch up to the West? How do you think their quality of life is ever going to reach our level? And in the developed countries, where we have experienced a good quality of life, you know, it ends up impoverishing us with hidden green taxes and giant energy companies passing the costs on to the consumer. And if things get ridiculous, you know, we end up being rationed and all that kind of thing. But of course, the person writing this article is an expensive scamming lord. None of this is going to affect him. He's too busy. This is actually what he did. He's too busy charging the public for mole catching and removing nests from his garden. I'm not too sure how many environmentalists are destroying bird nests in their gardens, but that's something that this Lord Deben charged to his account, his expenses. What a scumbag. He continues, second, this grouping signals a dissolving of the traditional divide between rich and poor countries. That's an important point. For long, international negotiations have been hampered by an overriding solidarity between developing countries and a culture of blame. Durban saw a new maturity with the major developing countries partnering with progressive developed countries and beginning to take responsibility for the future direction of the global economy. Translation, we're all going to be poor together. And I'd speculate that a lot of the poorer countries probably do see what's really behind a lot of this green agenda, but if you look at it from their perspective, this is just a thought, but if you look at it from their perspective, they've seen Britain, they've seen the British Empire, colonialism, the exploitation of their resources in more modern times. If they can see a future where they're up on a level playing field as us, it's sold that way, we're all in this together kind of thing. It doesn't matter if we're poor and we're all poor together. They're at least one more rung up the ladder closer to us. We're all being screwed together. And I think maybe some of the smaller countries are kind of bitter towards us or whatever from things in the past, and they think, well, who cares? At least we're all going to be in this together. I'll sign up to this as well. Ignoring, of course, the priest class that will be above everything. Remember how I talked about a few weeks ago, Dr. Shearman of the IPCC talking about a priest class that's authoritarian and is looking out for the earth, of course, but they'll dictate to everybody else. This shift of tectonic plates is based on enlightened self-interest. Whose enlightened self-interests? I mean, just look at the title of this guy's article, of this Lord's article. Durban illuminates the emerging New World Order. It's like you're taking the piss. Like, you can pick a more convenient title for conspiracy theorists or whatever to jump on. Durban illuminates the emerging New World Order. It's about a tectonic shift based on enlightened self-interest. Whose enlightened self-interest? On the one hand, there is no long-term scenario under which a fossil fuels-based economy is either sustainable or desirable for the human race as a whole. Reliance on fossil fuels with supply risk in terms of political stability in oil-producing regions, dwindling supplies and volatile prices. Well, I agree that fossil fuels, is probably not the best thing we should be using right now. But then he continues, together with an unstable climate caused by increasing emissions of greenhouse gases, present serious risks to the growing economy. And that's where I disagree. It's this tacking on of the climate change subject that gives these people the power to reshape humanity. Because carbon is life. We breathe out CO2. Plants breathe CO2. On the other hand, the economic opportunities presented by the low-carbon economy represent a major source of sustainable growth over the next few decades, while protecting the climate from dangerous human interference. With the existing regulatory and legislative frameworks, investment in clean energy is already rising fast, and these countries were at the forefront. You've also got to ask yourself, whose economy is this helping? Because he talks about how, it's great sustainable growth, blah, 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 blah. Well, who is it helping? Whose investments in green energy are paying off? Al Gore is the first carbon billionaire. The existing regulatory and legislative frameworks and investment in clean energy, that's certainly helping Al Gore. Whereas, just like last year, this year in Britain, old people are going to die from the cold. I'm not sure whether any of this is helping their economy right now. The old lady having to find blankets from, the fire service, calling up, 999 to get the firemen out there just to give her something to keep her warm. I'm not sure whether her economy is doing too well. I also like the phrase, while protecting the climate from dangerous human interference. Well, it was only the other week that the IPCC rewrote the definition of climate change to include natural cycles and what they call natural variability. They had to admit that they don't know if extreme weather, the occurrence of extreme weather is natural or down to man-made climate change. They don't know. They didn't even know if extreme weather has increased or not. So they certainly can't attribute it to man-made climate change because they don't even know from the data whether there are more hurricanes or whatever. Climate change is a natural process. And there may be some element of man in there. I don't know at what point you say man isn't natural anyway, but, you know, that's just all semantics, I guess. But they framed it in such a way that all climate change is somehow down to man. But you've got to remember, there was climate change on this earth long before man even existed. There are natural cycles to things. But now it's all dangerous human, you know, blah, blah, blah. Well, if you want to look at dangerous human interference of the environment, then why don't we start looking at things like cloned animal meat making it into the food chain, GMO food, geoengineering of the atmosphere. You know, for climate change, they've talked about reflecting the sun, aerosol spraying, sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, all these things. To me, that sounds like dangerous, you know, human interactions with the environment. And this nicely moves us on to the next story today, and that's, it is out of the Daily Mail, so they're obviously whipping up hate. They're always whipping up something, but it's still an interesting story nonetheless. Moth, health fears over plans to release millions of GM insects designed to destroy pests. Millions of genetically modified insects designed to destroy food crop pests could be released into the countryside. The government is considering plans by a British company for the open release of a GM strain of diamondback moth which it has developed. Diamondback moths attack cabbages, broccoli, cauliflower and similar crops. With the GM strain, a lethal gene is inserted into the male of the species so that when they mate with wild females, their offspring die almost immediately, causing the population to crash. That could lead to increasing crop yields and profits for farmers. The company involved, Oxitec, is keen to begin trials next year, but faces opposition from groups who say the untested technology could threaten wildlife and human health. The idea that man is playing God in this way is also controversial. Dr. Helen Wallace, the director of GeneWatch UK, who has sat on the government advisory bodies, said the release of GM frankenmoths is potentially disastrous. Mass release of GM insects into the British countryside would be impossible to recall if anything went wrong, she said. Changing one part of an ecosystem can have knock-on effects on others in ways that are poorly understood. This could include an increase in different types of pests. Wildlife that feeds on insects could be harmed if there are changes to their food supply. GM insects that bite animals or humans could cause allergies or transmit diseases, and new diseases might evolve. The Oxitec team of scientists based in Oxford insist these modified insects are better for the environment than the harsh chemical sprays currently used to kill pests. How about we have neither? The firm, which is supported by grants from the taxpayer, is developing a number of GM insects. The taxpayer, a number of GM insects that would be used in Britain and around the world to protect crops and combat diseases in humans. Well, I hope that doesn't mean taxpayers are funding GM insects to be used in other places other than Britain, but I don't know. But yeah, I mean, did we get to vote on the use of taxpayer frankenmoths? I mean, I don't remember this coming up. You know, what if you don't want to murder moths? Oxitec has contacted the Health and Safety Executive to ask what controls, if any, should be put in place around GM moth trials. A scientific paper written for the HSC's Scientific Advisory Committee on Genetic Modification details how trials would work. There are a number of scenarios ranging from open release into fields to a more controlled experiment using polytunnels with insect-proof screens at each end. Dr. Wallace has accused Oxitec of trying to sidestep regulations designed to police GM technology. But the company appears to have the support of the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, which has raised no objections to open field trials. Of course they're not, they're all bought and paid for. This raises questions about the role of Environmental Secretary Caroline Spellman, who is a long-term supporter of GM technology. Oh, great. The scientific paper points out that the proposals would effectively circumvent the policing regime, the deliberate release regulations set up to scrutinize the release of GM organisms. So they've done it in such a way that this moth can get, this genetically modified moth can get past all the rules and laws for whatever reason. And then admits that approving trials through the HSC raises difficult legal and policy issues. Usually GM trials have to be approved by DEFRA. Significantly, the paper makes clear that DEFRA has not objected to open field trials, providing there are guarantees for the safety of humans and the environment. So guarantees, okay, I guarantee, that's all it is just somebody saying, I guarantee that this is not going to harm anyone. Well, do we want to risk it just because some suit for some giant Oxitec company says so, or I don't know. And I'm not going to, pretend that I understand the science behind this fully, but I will make one point. We've grown food for a very long time. It's what humans do. We grow food. Are these moths really that much of a problem? I mean, is this something we've been talking about for thousands of years, those damn moths? If we just got rid of those moths, humans would be living in a utopia? I mean, is it that much of a problem? Or are they kind of clutching at straws, just looking at the next possible way of increasing profits? Maybe it's got something to do with that, I'm not sure. What exactly are the motives? Because you could be fooled into thinking that the government are looking out for the best interests of the people. Obviously, having plentiful food is a good thing. Who cares about some moths that probably can't feel pain and probably don't even know that they're alive? But if this was about creating an abundance of food for the people of Britain, then as I talked about a few weeks ago, we'd probably be teaching kids to grow and tend to vegetable gardens at school as a fundamental part of the curriculum. What better way of looking after the well-being of the population than teaching them to look after their own basic human needs of food? It's not that hard. Even if you live in a high-rise flat, you can still grow your own food these days. But no, what this looks like, to me, is just another profit-driven policy. Not just for the farmers, but also the Oxitec company. I mean, once they've sold their GM moths and they get a contract, they're going to be selling them year after year after year. And what happens if the natural moth population completely dies out? Will we just have to keep paying Oxitec to make us fake moths? To keep restocking? And you also got to think about, the birds, the bats and whatever that eat moths. If there's a sharp decrease in the moth population, how's that going to affect them? Have they really thought that through yet? And one of my problems with science, I know, no problems with science? Science is science. You can't argue with science. Well, frankly, if that's your opinion on science, then you may as well be part of a religion. Science is allowed to be criticised. And my point is, I think sometimes we do go too far. And I'm not saying we shouldn't evolve and we shouldn't make new technologies, but are we creating these quote Franken moths because we need them, or are we creating them because we can, and money can be made from them? You know, it's like the government who are forever looking to make new rules and new laws. You don't have to protect everybody from everything. If there isn't a law for something, you don't have to create one. It's like they're bored. Oh, let's make more legislation. It's the same thing. There are moths that exist that eat cabbage. So what? Who cares? You don't have to kill the moths. It's called Earth. Leave Earth alone. Anyway, moving on, because the show always goes quick. We only have the hour. I want to jump to a clip of Ron Paul that's been floating around the alternative fringes of the great interwebs today, that is kind of framing it as if Ron Paul has sold out to Israel. Now, I'll play the clip, and then I'll come back and talk about it. But I think the people posting this video around aren't quite being fair about what he's saying.
You supported Israel in 1981 when they attacked an Iraqi nuclear reactor. Do you support today the right of Israel to attack Iran, Iraq, or any other nation in its defense?
Yeah, I think the conditions are very similar, and if they believe it's in their national security interests, that should be their decisions and not ours. It's because I was disappointed that I couldn't go.
Do you support today the right of Israel to attack Iran, Iraq, or any other nation in its defense?
Yeah, I think the conditions are very similar.
There was a time in the 1980s when you strongly disagreed with Reagan, President Reagan, and your party. It was when Israel attacked a nuclear reactor in 1981. Almost the entire U.S. Congress voted to condemn that act, and you were one of the few Republicans who stood up and said that Israel should not have to answer to America for how she defends herself. Why shouldn't Israel be allowed to defend herself in any way she sees fit without listening to the dictates of the United States?
Right. I remember that vote very clearly because I was criticized, and the spirit of the moment was we have to condemn him for doing this because it was a violation of the sovereignty of Iraq and this sort of thing. So to me it was Israel's business. So I was voting for their independence. And I think this is a big difference in the way I look at Israel. I think Israel should be treated as an independent nation and not a puppet of our state, because right now what they have is they depend on us for military and they depend on us for money, and if they want to have a peace treaty they have to ask us. If they want to defend their borders they have to get permission. But I think what some people fail to understand is Zionism is based on two basic principles: independence and self-reliance.
Well, there's a few things you could talk about with this interview. In a general sense, I think people often misunderstand where Ron Paul is coming from when he's given these limited kind of, interviews, and he doesn't get that much coverage. Let's be fair. A lot of it is soundbited and stuff. Americans are so used to the propaganda and the political rhetoric and everything that is corporate American politics, that I don't always think they even know what Ron Paul's actually saying. One example you could use is the old Ron Paul is a racist, which is still kind of pushed around as something, on the left. A lot of people still call Ron Paul a racist. But in a nutshell, okay, this is the example. In a nutshell, what was reported, I can't remember how many years ago, the clips are on YouTube or whatever, but that Ron Paul would allow shop owners to ban black people from their shops. What? Ron Paul said that? But you got to understand that Ron Paul's perspective, now I'm not saying this as if I support him 100%, but Ron Paul's perspective is 100% personal freedom without the government sticking their beak in. Therefore, He wouldn't have all the thousands and thousands of pieces of legislation that dictate what people can and can't do. He's just for the Constitution. He's saying if you don't want to enter into business with another person, it's your right not to do that. And that was, extrapolated out to mean, oh, Ron Paul hates black people. No, Ron Paul wants freedom for everybody. He wants, the raw milk sellers to be able to sell their raw milk, and we can talk about raw milk, and I'm sure Pacificus will love to tell us all about how bad milk is. But whatever, Ron Paul wants the government to stop giving, ridiculous amounts of subsidies to big agri-cartels. He's a hardcore free market person. So it may be a little difficult to get your head around his take on freedom and free markets. But do you think if there was no legislation, people would all of a sudden start turning away black people from shops? Of course not. That implies that the only reason America is tolerant is because they're being forced to be. Like, it's just full of seething racists that are just being made by the government to serve black people at shops. That's ridiculous. If a store started to turn people away, there'd be an uproar. People would boycott the store. People would be protesting. And this is the point. It's self-responsibility. It's all right to have self-responsibility for things. Just because the government isn't writing racism laws doesn't mean we'll all become racist. But going back to this clip about Israel, that people are jumping on, Ron Paul is bought and paid for by the Zionists. Well, no, what he's saying is it's not America's business what Israel is or isn't doing. If Israel determines Iran is a threat and chooses to bomb Iran, then Israel has to face the consequences of that without America being its big bodyguard to back it up. And you could perhaps say that he's being naive or deliberately naive, I'm sure he knows, but naive about how much power Israel actually has. And it might actually be that America's, in many respects, the puppet of Israel, not the other way on. But he doesn't support the bombing of Iran, and he also doesn't support all this aid and the special relationship America has with Israel. So from his perspective, if we're not in bed with Israel, then what business does America have being the world's policeman? As long as Israel and Iran aren't a threat to America, it's not America's business. And the only reason why Iran is inflammatory towards America is because we are in bed with Israel, or America is in bed with Israel, so is Britain really, and they're being proactive against Iran. So I don't know if that makes sense to anybody. Maybe you've got a different interpretation of what he was saying, but you can find the whole thing online, I guess. Now, in terms of Ron Paul talking about Palestine and what his take is on all that, I've pulled up a few things that will probably clarify that. Here's a rebuttal to the whole Newt Gingrich Palestinians are an invented people. Well, Ron Paul says Palestinians are not an invented people. In the ABC Iowa debate Saturday night, Ron Paul contradicted former House Speaker Newt Gingrich's claim that the Palestinians are an invented people. Earlier in the week, Gingrich made the controversial remark, saying that he believes that the Jewish people have the right to a state. Remember, there was no Palestine as a state, it was part of the Ottoman Empire. I think that we've had an invented Palestinian people who are in fact Arabs, Gingrich said, and who were historically part of the Arab community. Asked about these remarks, Ron Paul disagreed, saying that under the Ottoman Empire, Neither the Israelis or the Palestinians had an official state. Paul accused Gingrich of stirring up trouble. Paul's views on the Israel-Palestine conflict are controversial. Well, not really, but unlike many in both the Republican and Democratic parties, Paul has been a harsh critic of Israeli actions against Palestinians, and an even harsher critic of the US government's unqualified support of Israel, a country he believes should manage its own destiny. On Twitter, Gary Johnson, who was once again not invited to the debate, echoed Paul, saying that Israel will determine its own future, and it's wrong for US to presume to determine it for them. And here's another article that goes into it a bit more, because obviously Israel was given its kind of state. Only a political class harboring the illusion it can run the world obsesses over, this is Ron Paul, obsesses over the aspirations of a tiny population on a tiny piece of land thousands of miles away. Remember, the UN initiated this persistent conflict with its 1947 partition plan. As the nations of the world align themselves with either the US or Israeli position, align themselves with either the US-Israeli position or Palestinians, Congressman Paul laments the I can't even read today, folks, strictly American constitutional consideration of the matter. Basically, he doesn't support the UN either. We rarely seem to hear the view of those who support the US side and US interests. I am on that side. I believe that we can no longer police the world. We can no longer bribe the Israelis and Palestinians to continue an endless peace process that goes nowhere. It is not in our interest to hector the Palestinians or the Israelis or to export democracy to the region, but reject it when people vote the wrong way. The UN is a threat to our sovereignty, and as we are the main source of its income, it is a threat to our economic well-being. Increasingly, over the past several years, we see the United Nations providing political and legal cover for the military aspirations of interventionists, rather than serving as an international forum to preserve peace. Neoconservatives in the US have grown to love the United Nations as they co-opt the organization under the guise of endless reform. Under the sovereignty-destroying doctrine of responsibility to protect, adopted at the 2005 World Summit, the UN takes upon itself to intervene in internal conflicts of its member states whenever it believes that human rights are being violated. We all see how that goes with Libya and every other country we've invaded recently, Iraq and so on. Thus, under responsibility to protect, the UN provides the green light for a kind of global no-knock raid on any sovereign country. So, you get his point. I definitely see his point. We shouldn't be the world's policeman. That being America and Britain and whoever else wants to tag along with us. It leads to things like Iraq, like I said, Libya. Now, I'm also definitely, if I was going to pick a side, I'm obviously pro-Palestine. But would you guys support military intervention to back up Palestine? I'd have to have a very, very long think about something like that. And I think obviously step one wouldn't be a military invasion. It would be just stop supporting Israel. To take neither side. And I think that's kind of what Ron Paul's getting at. It's not our job. And in a wider sense, am I personally a Ron Paul supporter? Right now, I think I am. And I'm not naive in thinking that everything's going to be perfect as soon as Ron Paul gets into office. I think too many people are looking through rosy-coloured glasses. You have to remember that there's a lot more to government than just the president. In fact, really, the president is almost It's like a ceremonial thing. If you think that the president is the one in charge, then what do you really have? You have a dictatorship, and the president does what he wants. So I think the whole idea of a president is quite ridiculous. But in the current state of the world, he's the best there is right now for America. He's pretty much the only hope right now that the world has to end all these illegal wars and bring the troops home. I don't see Britain going into countries if America's not with them. That alone is a step in the right direction. If we can prevent more needless deaths, then I'm going to be for that. And I also have a lot of time for what he says about the economy. Is he 100% correct with everything he says? I don't know, but I'm willing to listen to what he has to say. I still think a transition to this, quote, free market capitalism would need to be done extremely carefully. I mean, you can't just pull all the regulations away tomorrow and think that the elite and the cartels and the corporate brainwashing is just going to disappear like that and we're all going to be saved. There needs to be a massive scaling back. It's almost like you have to go to a day one scenario and start again, because there's already cartels and all this kind of stuff in place. Take away the regulations, it may end up getting worse. But I'm interested in what he has to say. When I was at Occupy London, I actually had a sign raising some of the Ron Paul style kind of thinking. It said the bailout, corporate tax evasion, lobbying and all that. That's not a capitalist issue. It's a fascist issue. It's the state and the corporation using both systems for a kind of combined goal. And, the free market tend to, I think, take a lot of the blame away from the corporations. But in my opinion, together is what's the problem. I don't think you can blame government 100%. I don't think you can blame corporations 100%. It's this, kind of, I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine kind of deal. And so I think a lot of the Occupy Wall Street would do good if they would actually listen to the libertarians. And I also think the libertarians need to be a bit more tactful in how they approach these people, because I think a lot of you would have seen the Adam Kokesh stuff, where he's kind of irritating them, and everyone's just got their egos, on their sleeves, and they're not sharing ideas, they're not discussing, they're dictating what they know and why they're right to each other, and it's not really working. But yeah, I have a lot of time for Ron Paul. He's a million times better than anybody else running for American president. And that doesn't mean we have to settle for the lesser of two evils, but I don't think Ron Paul is an evil. I personally think he's genuine. And he's not perfect, nobody's perfect, and I know a lot of people hold the fact that he's a Christian against him and stuff, but people are allowed to believe what they want to believe. He wants to believe in Christ or God or whatever. As long as he's not bombing Iraq while, talking about Jesus or whatever, like Bush, then I don't care. And I know people are going to email me now and say, oh, but didn't you know that Ron Paul is a Mason? Watch this video, 1,000% proof Ron Paul is Freemason. Bring me an article with sources or a video that isn't, dubbed over with scary music. Then I may start listening to what you have to say. And I would love to discuss the negatives of Ron Paul being a Freemason if it's proven to be a fact that he is a Freemason. But so far, all I've seen is, the YouTube conspiracy porn. Big dramatic music, 2 seconds of a handshake that, probably just looks like a handshake, So, that's kind of that. I also wanted to touch on today, before we run out of time. Well, actually, I'm going to go to a break, and then I'm going to come back and get into some news from New Zealand, because they're having kind of the next round of codex, which is being enforced onto them, and I'll get into that after this quick break. I did that last week, folks. Forgot to unmute the mic after a song. Anyway, welcome back to the show. I was going over what we'd already talked about this week quickly, but I'll do it again. We were just talking about Ron Paul and this video that's floating around that claims to prove, oh, Ron Paul sold out to the Zionists and whatever. And I think people aren't being very fair with this video. A lot of what Ron Paul says takes a little bit to digest, to fully understand where he's coming from. But basically, like I was saying, I think that he's just saying we shouldn't get involved with Israel. We shouldn't be funding Israel, or America shouldn't be funding Israel. You know, it doesn't have to get involved. If Israel wants to bomb Iran, that's kind of Israel's business. We need to not facilitate them doing that, but it's not our business. But moving on, I'm going to go to something that was sent to me by, I'll say it wrong, but A Car for You New Zealand, or it could be A Car for You New Zealand, but somebody who's on my YouTube subscriptions, I believe. He pointed me to a bill in New Zealand that makes growing your own food a government privilege rather than a human right. And this, of course, is Codex Alimentarius rearing its ugly head again. And it may not be that people's veg patches get torn up by stormtroopers tomorrow, but even the potential for that needs to be avoided. It's like the FEMA hype that's going around America right now, particularly pushed by, you know, Alex Jones and so on, and this indefinite detention of Americans and so on. It doesn't necessarily mean that citizens are going to be carted off tomorrow to the camps, but it's another step in that direction. It's an enabler. It's tyranny waiting to happen. And that wouldn't be waiting to happen if everybody had individual freedom. But no, the big daddy governments have to swoop in and protect us. And in New Zealand right now, with this food bill, or food security bill, it will make it illegal to distribute any type of food, including seeds, nutrients, natural medicines, minerals, and even water, without expressed government permission. In other words, you know, it's kind of an extension of the whole milk pasteurization thing. Because these big corner-cutting corporations were too busy trying to make profits, so they mass-produced milk, and the stuff got contaminated once years ago. Now all the nutrients has to be killed off through pasteurization. And the little guy with one cow who wants to sell his milk to Bob down the road in some parts of the world is now not allowed to do that. The big corporations that are destroying food, and they're now the only ones allowed to officially sell it under this guise of food safety. We only trust the big corporations. This little guy over here could be doing anything. Well, it was the big corporations that caused the problem in the first place. You know, a complete backwards way of looking at things, but that's modern government. And that seems to be the MO with this control freak UN codex rubbish that all these member countries are happy to bend over for, it seems. It's another enabling act. It's something on paper that sometime in the future, and folks, it's being abused now. You've seen videos of local farmers and stuff in America getting shut down and all that kind of thing. But it's just that next step. We're pretty much out of time, actually. Be sure to come back in half an hour for the reality check show with Bluebus. But from me and the WideShut Webcast, I'll catch you next week. Hopefully. It's Boxing Day, so I can't promise that I'll be doing a show, but I am planning to do one. But you never know what comes up with family or whatever over the Christmas period. But, cheers everybody. I will catch you next week. Hopefully.
If you found the preceding information valuable, please consider buying a DVD or making a small donation of your choosing. Go to wideshut.co.uk/donate. That's wideshut.co.uk/donate. You are the resistance.